Doug, Nathan, and Stephen back. You can be a tech subscriber in the offseason. It kind of keeps the juices flowing. 614-350-3315. We have not talked about this because we were off for a week. And this thing was going down a week ago, Nathan, as we were like, well, we have pre-recorded the Monday podcast. That brief moment in time when it seemed like, could cj Stroud come back? Probably not. But maybe, probably not. But maybe in the end, cj Stroud, on the day that you had to decide, I mean, he did wait until then. So we don't have to cover a bunch of like, well, what was going on, whatever. The bottom line is, Nathan, what would we be talking about? We can do 5 minutes on this because it's a thing that had a very small chance of ever happening. But if cj Stroud had said he was back, are not these guys preseason number one? He's the odds-on Heisman favorite. He has a chance to go down as one of the greatest players in Ohio State history. All those things were out there, and he didn't shut the door on that until the last day to shut the door on it.
I think that's the better way to phrase it. I mean, I've talked to people who, and you did too, that said, hey, like legitimately, like he's given this some thought, or to use an oft-used Buckeye Talk phrase, it's given him pause. And I talked to other people who maybe push back on that a little bit around it, who said like, well, I don't know how much he seriously considered it. I don't know that he was like, drawing it out for dramatic effect, but he didn't have to. Well, actually, he didn't have to announce anything. But Monday was the day that you had. Last Monday was the day that you had to put your name in. So I think we'd be talking about how he just shocked the college football world. I think we'd be talking about how he kind of upended the NFL draft a little bit, because a lot of the narrative around the NFL draft right now is, well, there's 3 quarterbacks. And who's going to trade up, and will somebody have to trade up? Can the people who need them, it would have been awesome for Justin Fields and the Chicago Bears, frankly, if you took one of these 3 guys out, because now their number 1 pick overall becomes more valuable. And we'd be talking about, boy, if you thought Paris Johnson got jobbed by just having to play a season of right guard, well, what just happened to Kyle McCord when cj Stroud decides to come back? When we talk to people, I talk to people in Atlanta. I talked to Kyle McCord. I talked to Devin Brown. You talk to other people around that team. So as recently as the Peach Bowl, and nobody was even whispering at that time that cj Stroud, like this was even in the clouds, like that he was maybe going to come back. So he'll, I'm sure, tell the full story someday as to when he made the decision. He hasn't told that story yet, but yeah, would have been nuts. It would have been absolutely nuts. I actually sent a text that morning being like, hey, I know you guys probably think you're waking up to a podcast about how cj Stroud, what's going on with all this, but hey, here's just how wrong we were about who was going to lead Ohio State in tackles last season.
Oh, right. But anyway, let's talk about Steel Chambers. So, I mean, and again, this has been covered. As far as I know, I don't think everyone on the beat took the week off just because Buckeye Talk took the week off. That actually would be a good rule. Let's all take a week off together. And you guys were still writing at cleveland.com/OSU. But obviously, Andrew Luck had a chance to leave more than a decade ago and stayed at Stanford. Justin Herbert could have come out the year before he did at Oregon and probably been the first quarterback off the board. He stayed. It's not impossible. But the one thing that happened, Stephen, and there's been a lot of talk about this, and this is probably an NIL podcast for us a little bit later. A lot of Michigan guys have stayed at Michigan. Tommy Eichenbergs of the world, some of those guys, Cade Stover, some guys who have stayed at Ohio State. It feels like Michigan was very, very upfront with some of those guys. Cornelius Johnson, a couple of their offensive linemen, that they had an NIL. One of their collectives, I think, was like very specifically like making a push of like, keep these guys here. And that's the thing, Stephen. I think keeping 4th and 5th round or even 3rd rounders in school an extra year is doable. Keeping a 1st rounder, if it was like, man, if there would be an NIL thing that would have because I guess Florida State had it. There's a Florida State defensive end who people expected to go pro and be a top 15 pick who stayed. And I think there's some NIL stuff related to this. It's got to be a personal decision first, Stephen, but if there had somehow been NIL influence that would have allowed cj Stroud to decide to stay at Ohio State another year, that's a whole new world. Because that to me is multiple millions of dollars to even bring that thought into play. And I just thought, if this happens, we are in a new reality, even though Luck and Herbert did it pre-NIL. And then it turns out it didn't happen. But we're not there yet, Stephen. We're first, top 5 picks are saying, like, you know what? This NIL will let me stay in school for another year because they're going to give me $70 million.
Oh, my. $70 million to play college football for 1 year is
yeah.
I'm going to get in the gym.
No cap. No cap.
Yeah, no cap in both ways. But
I accidentally said a cool thing. I accidentally said a cool thing.
Live. You got to let it live. Nope. You can't ruin it. Don't ruin it by saying you said the cool thing. Yeah, you were good. I do wonder how much of a gap has to be closed there, because let's just say somebody offered some NIL deal, offered cj-stroud $4 million or $5 million to stay. That doesn't close the gap for a guy who might be the number 1 pick in the draft when the number 1 pick makes like $20 million signing bonus. It's just not enough. But if it's a guy like Zach Harrison, who might be a first rounder, but it's number 31, I don't know, maybe that closes the gap a little bit and go, I can up my draft stock while also not sacrificing the money I would have made anyway. So that's even the Cade Stover, Tommy Eichenberg, Steele Chambers is interesting, yes, as late round guys. But I'm more interested in the guys who are borderline first rounders, where if I offer you $4 million to stay, you probably would have made that in a camp anyway. So cool, I'll stick around another year and try to do that type of stuff. That's where it's more interesting for me. But also, if you can do that, then you can't complain that you don't have enough money for the recruits. Because you could just tell that collective, hey, instead of trying to spend that on a quarterback who has done his piece, how about we go spend that money on some kid from Florida or some kid from Texas?
But
I'm not saying the school should do that. I'm saying the collective should just think that way.
Well, but that's where we are going to have to do some podcasts about NIL, because that's one of the things, that's one of the disconnects here in the discourse around this. Money that would have kept cj-stroud here, or the first round guy that you're talking about, is not collective money. It's coming in from big brands. It's like the deal that last year was Stroud, Henderson, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Denzel Burke. It was like a $550,000 thing with the American Eagle, whatever, like that sort of thing. That's where that money comes from. We're going to hear, I'm told, there's going to be, the contracts are still being signed, whatever. Some of the guys who came back did have some NIL deals. I don't know if they were, we have to be careful how we're using these words. I'm using these words kind of colloquially. Like, I don't think those were used as coercion to get them to come back or incentive to get them to come back necessarily. But it's always been one of the supposed positives, the alleged positives of NIL when it was being pushed as a solution here, that, a guy doesn't have to make a decision between coming back to college and making no money and a even late round NFL contract. Like, now you have a little something that can bridge that gap. So, the thing with, like, we were getting a lot of texts from people who were like, why are we talking about even spending money on cj-stroud, because we have good quarterbacks? Why don't we using that money to get a tackle and a cornerback? And I tried to explain to people, like, no, this is like, we're talking about two separate things, and we need to do a better job explaining that. So I'm trying to get on some reporting that can maybe better explain that.
It is one of those things I do think, like, bang for the buck. I'll be curious. Some of these big brands, I guess it's no different than any other celebrity endorser, but I don't know. Did American Eagle get its money's worth? And that's not a shot. I mean, like, cj-stroud was awesome, but, like, did they sell any extra khakis? I don't know. And then the other thing too is your bang for the buck of, you keep a player in school for a year versus let someone who's been developing rise up, and you get one extra year of a good player, because if he was an exceptional player, he's a first-round pick and he's not staying. So it's a good, solid player. But if you're a big-time program, you always have good, solid players. And so, like, some of it is, at some point, there is a cycle to this sport that originally was thrown off by the extra year of COVID. And we saw the impact of that now might be thrown off, or maybe it's thrown off is the wrong word, but the reality, Nathan, might change of, I thought I was a backup for 2 years. I thought in year 3 I was going to start. And all of a sudden, this guy who was a third-team All-American, second-team All-Conference, was projected as a third-round pick. And I thought he would leave after 4 years, decided to stay because he had a redshirt year, because he got some money to stay. And now all of a sudden, like, is that better? Is that better for the health of the program? Does it make you a better team that year? Because, again, like, as much as people want to tackle, if you can keep CJ Stroud, you keep CJ Stroud. But the guys that Michigan kept, right? They're good players. I don't know. Is that the difference between Michigan getting back to the playoff next year or not? Or would it just been like, oh, no, this other recruit would have started in year 3? You know what I mean, Nathan? That we have to all sort of readjust our thing. And there's been sort of a life cycle to good college football players that may change.
Yeah, I mean, but we saw kind of the real life example of that with what happened on the offensive line in 2021, and to some extent, Paris Johnson could have asserted himself and won one of the other jobs, I guess. I mean, that was what they decided was the best configuration there. It makes things tricky for coaching staffs, I guess. But I also think that I still think it's going to be rare. That I think if CJ Stroud had come back. Because all those guys that you mentioned before, Justin Herbert, Andrew Luck, go back to when I was, a pup, and Steven may not have even been born yet. Peyton Manning was like, everyone thought he was the most famous college football player in the country, and decided to come back for a senior year, and still got drafted by a terrible team that won 3 games its first year or whatever. So it's not like, people were speculating, oh, maybe CJ Stroud doesn't want to be drafted by the Texans, and maybe CJ Stroud. I think he would have come back, no matter however serious this was. It would have been coming back for reasons that weren't really the money, because you would have been passing up money either way.